Okay, so previous weeks we have been talking about things like the development of the practice of history, the development of the medieval studies as a discipline, changing popular and academic ideas of the Middle Ages, and most recently, race as kind of a useful category of analysis for medieval studies. Today, as the title of this lecture suggests, I want to talk about whiteness and medieval studies as they both kind of coexist in contemporary fiction fantasy. Because recently, culture wars slash the discourse trademark on Twitter and elsewhere have focused on whitewashing a lot, and for good reason, right? Um, this was a couple of years back, where Scarlett Johansson being cast as a Japanese character. It was even worse than that. Like they made her Japanese in her head, but not in her body. Um, but these kind of whitewashing kind of incidents have come under increasing scrutiny from what we shall call the cultural left, and I think for good reason on that point. Um, and of course, as kind of things evolve these days, if the left kind of objects to something as problematic, kind of legitimacy, the right will try to find something similar to object to because, equivalent exchange or something like that. And so the right kind of right wing responses usually involve things like just objecting to the fact that black actors appear in a thing. But there's a particular objection from this kind of right wing conservative nationalist white identity for black actors appearing in period pieces, in pieces that are supposed to take place in the Middle Ages, in places where black actors are not expected, right? And so you had this guy, Chris Wood, who was, I don't believe he is anymore, a fascist, what's a UKIP counselor in the United Kingdom, objecting to Sophie Okonedo playing the historical character Margaret of Anjou. And you can see here he's using a medieval manuscript, a medieval depiction of Margaret of Anjou, to argue that Sophie Okonedo is clearly not fit for the role. And of course, despite the fact, like, who cares, first of all, but second of all, I loved this response. It was fantastic, which is that the manuscript, yes, okay, it shows Margaret of Anjou as white, but it also claims that she was descended from a swan, and that seems not to be an important criteria for Mr. Chris Wood when he objects to an actor or an actress playing a role. And so we have a little bit of picking and choosing going on here. But Marvel's Thor, right, is an extreme example of this. Of course, like, it's a Marvel movie. There's no resemblance to anything in the actual kind of Norse mythology, aside from basically proper names and kind of vague skill sets. And there has nevertheless, because even though, like, there's the Incredible Hulk, like, what? Even though it's a Marvel movie, there was not a small amount of controversy over the casting of Idris Elba as the Norse god and kind of defender of Asgard, Heimdall, with the objection, among other things, that first of all, there weren't any black people in Scandinavia, so this is anachronistic somehow, and that also there is a Norse text, I think it's in Icelandic, which proclaims Heimdall to be the whitest of the gods, and therefore this is entirely a problem because reasons. And this lecture is going to be a lot about unpacking those reasons. These objections to Idris Elba's casting kind of have three problems, let's say. First of all, it assumes like that complaint that Idris Elba is playing the whitest of all the gods assumes that whiteness means the same thing in a 13th century Icelandic that it does now. Kind of what we talked about last class or last lecture, that like ideas of race can go back and we can just say, oh, it says whitest, so we must mean whitest in the way we mean it now. And also, this is a movie with a freaking raccoon in a tree doing a buddy cop routine. Like, what? Why? Right? Those are kind of the two basic reactions I've had to this. But I kind of want to push that further because I don't like those answers because it concedes a basic point that kind of these people are making that I don't want to concede, which is that people of color were absolutely foreign to medieval Scandinavia, right? That's kind of the assumption that's kind of underlying it there. And I don't think that's true for a lot of reasons, and we're going to go into that. On some ways we can't be sure because we have a source problem, as I talked about last lecture. We don't really know. We haven't done the work to ascertain what info in our sources actually contains information about medieval racializations, right? We've just tried to kind of take what we currently have and see if we can find it back in medieval texts, and that's not necessarily going to yield any results, right? As we talked about with the kind of discussion over "I am black yet beautiful," "I am black and beautiful" in the Song of Songs last lecture, excuse me. And there, kind of on the other side, there are in fact an abundance of images of persons of color in medieval images, as you can see on these multiple things behind me. From illuminations of various kind of medieval manuscripts. These date from the 12th through the 16th century, I think. Particular among these kind of images of persons of color in medieval art are images of this guy who we've talked about before. This is Saint Maurice, who is Maurice. He's considered a Moor or dark-skinned from late 12th century or mid 12th century onwards, and on his flag there is a black eagle, because Saint Maurice is the patron saint of the Holy Roman Empire. So, that thing that's not holy, not Roman, not empire, that is kind of the major political unit for all of what is now Germany, kind of the Low Countries, most of France, and northern Italy. This guy's their patron saint, right? And as I said, they always thought he was, or for most of the Middle Ages, they thought he had dark skin. And there is extensive kind of, in addition to kind of all these kind of images of kind of people of color existing in the Middle Ages, there is extensive evidence for constant contact between Scandinavia, right? The place where Heimdall theoretically came from, right? And the broader world. But kind of there's this problem where white/Eurocentric memory of Norse culture remembers Vikings, Norse, kind of this Scandinavian memory as one which imposes itself on other cultures without kind of being corrupted by them, right? In the same way that, say, the British, when they colonized India in the 19th century, liked to think of themselves as imposing themselves on a native population, but never taking anything out of that native population. Of course, this is not true. They took quite a bit out of that native population for everything from economics to culture. But the idea, like, going native is a pejorative, right? Is an insult, right? You've gotten too close. You've let yourself be corrupted by the people you're supposed to supervise and take things from. And we can see this recently with this here. This is a kind of a controversy that happened about 3 years ago. A scholar was looking at this Viking age fringe that was preserved, I think, in a peat bog or in a grave. It was a grave good of some sort. And they decided that kind of into this fringe was woven the a kind of Arabic script for Allah, right? God, right? And okay, I want to be like, this is bad scholarship. Um, like the scholar who thought this, she's wrong. This does not say Allah for two reasons. First of all, as you can kind of see, her reconstruction of it expands beyond the scope, the edges of the braid. Like she has to add more fabric to the sides. That doesn't work. And also the fringe itself is 10th century, and the script that she's trying to pretend exists there doesn't exist till the 13th century. So this is, yes, bad scholarship, but the reasons why it was being objected to are not necessarily on those grounds. Like, not everyone kind of went and looked at this. They were just like, no, of course, why would there be a Muslim Viking? And really, the idea that there were Muslim Vikings, that there were Vikings, people kind of in Scandinavia who followed a Muslim faith, or even came from the Middle East or Africa, or India, or kind of anywhere at the outside of what we continually think of as Viking territory, should not be surprising, right? There are, for the entirety of the Viking Age, as it were, which is, so let's call it 600 to 1200, roughly, there were extensive trade connections to the Islamic world. In fact, the Islamic world is the primary source of wealth for what we would now think of as Vikings. In fact, the Vikings took over existing trade routes between Europe and the Islamic world, or the existing, they took over, well, let's say, we've talked about the Holy Roman Empire and how it was the first thing that came into being after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, kind of as a political unity. The reason why the Holy Roman Empire, again, kind of that thing with Charlemagne sitting in what is now Germany, was able to come to power, to expand and be an empire for even only for a century or so in its own right, was it waged extensive military campaigns, captured a lot of people, and sold them to the Arab world as slaves in exchange for money. And that money, that gold that came out of the Muslim world, was the source of Europe's economy in the 7th and 8th century. And when kind of the Holy Roman Empire kind of reached the limits that it could expand to, and started, in fact, to collapse back in on itself, the Arab world still wanted people. They still wanted slaves. And so what we see is the uptick in the Viking raids that kind of immediately coincide with that kind of failure, the cessation of conquest from the Holy Roman Empire, seems to have been just trying to continue those supply chains, the demand for slaves in an Arab market, in a Middle Eastern market. And so there was extensive, as you can see, kind of commerce between Sweden, what is now Sweden, and kind of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea regions through the rivers Dnieper and Volga, particularly, kind of up and down this what is now kind of Western Russia. To the point in which, and there's a whole bunch of interesting things here. Like there's a whole family of caliphs who are considered by later caliphs to be kind of illegitimate and problematic. Kind of the insult thrown at them is they have blonde hair and blue eyes. Probably because their mother was a slave taken, and so there's interpenetration in both directions for a long period of time, culturally, economically, religiously, between the Islamic world and what we would say is the Viking world. So kind of the idea that there would be Muslim Vikings shouldn't really be that surprising. There's also no adherence to like, there's no homogeneity, right? There's no reason why we would assume homogeneity of what we would now call race within cultural or ethnographic kind of groupings in this period. Right? We know this to be true. We know that Vikings, so Norse Vikings, became Rus, Kievan Rus, living in kind of Poland, kind of Ukraine kind of area. And we know that Rus became Vikings. And these kind of terms are interchangeable. It depends on where you live, what kind of culture you decided to join. Right? The same way that we had problems with the term barbarian. Kind of at the fall of Rome. Like, you could be, whether or not you called yourself Roman or barbarian depends on what you were doing at that moment, right? Whether or not you called yourself Viking or Rus or Norse or whatever, depends on what you were doing. And so we see, again, things like, Vikings come, a lot of kind of people who live around Kiev come from kind of Scandinavian extraction. A lot of people who live in Iceland are of Irish extraction. Again, because of raiding, right? People are moving around a lot, far distances over this period. But so this is all kind of against this idea that the Vikings were this kind of homogeneous, monolithic culture that was able to raid and impose itself on other cultures without being influenced or corrupted by them. And the funny thing is that most of the time we're actually willing to, scholars are willing to accept that fact, that Norse culture wasn't monolithic. But only when it comes to interactions with Christian Europe. That is, we find both Christian kind of coins with Christian images and coins with Arabic or Muslim images, text or images in graves in Scandinavia. We find, of course, they're making money from both places, either raiding for it or selling people for it or anything like that. But Christian coins are signs of cross-culture, are taken and interpreted by archaeologists and historians as signs of cross-cultural accommodation. The idea that, there's a sign with, this says Carolus, this Charlemagne, this is a coin minted by Charlemagne, on the top there with the cross, that must mean there were some Christian Vikings, right? This is an argument that's been made. But the coin on the bottom, which has Arabic text, no, that they didn't understand what that was. That was just mere treasure. Right? So the facts are there. The interpretation is racist and racialized, right? The idea that we can have some Anglo-Saxon or Germanic influence on Norse culture, which is a good thing, but no Islamic influence on Norse culture, which they would see as a bad, kind of this 19th century, this racialization would see as a bad thing, is still an idea that persists to this day. And so kind of Heimdall or Elba as existing, right, is with the name with Idris Elba existing as a character with the name Heimdall is, in some senses, an assault on this kind of cherished idea, again, in both academic and popular spheres, of Scandinavian whiteness, right? And we've already traced most of this story, right? We started with Walter Scott, 19th century literature. I love this image. It's just like, could you be more Viking? On this cover of Ivanhoe, very interesting to contrast to the one of the volume that we currently have. We've talked about World War I propaganda, both kind of in the English-speaking world, in the German-speaking world, and in America as well, right? The idea that the First World War was kind of associated with this medieval kind of moment. But also, some things we haven't really talked about, which is this fear of like blackness and Judaism, which is wrapped up in that. You have this mad brute, this kind of ape image, which is again kind of evoking a fear of a black other. And again, rape of a white woman as kind of a popular motif of kind of racial, of the racial imaginary in this period. The picture on the right is kind of doing two things. It's first of all kind of giving you a fear of, yes, okay, there's this kind of crucifixion imagery. There's this German nailing an Allied soldier to a tree, right? That's Christ, but it's also kind of this pagan imagery as well. The idea that kind of unchristianized Germanic people would nail Christians to trees kind of as a joke. as it were. We've also seen this in campus architecture, whether it be kind of these ideas of medievalism in campus architecture, well, whether it be at Princeton, Yale, U Chicago, Harvard Divinity School, this is Sewanee, or in kind of the construction of cathedrals like this. This is, again, St. John the Divine, St. John the Unfinished in New York City. We've seen it in institutional collecting habits of museums, collecting armor and things like that. We've seen it in talking about lost cause medievalism and the medievalism of the South, right? But I kind of want to reemphasize the fact that Norse culture, Viking culture, is particularly important to this idea of the white Middle Ages. This is particularly like it's the central kind of core of it. Right, and we have again seen this a little bit kind of in Norumbega Tower, right? That kind of fake Viking tower that was created, the Narragansett Windmill, which we've talked about, the Kensington Runestone, again, kind of forgeries. And we can see this in kind of art and architecture. I love this image. This is an image entitled "The First Cargo" from the late 19th century of Vikings, I guess, coming to America, right? As opposed to what other there's first cargo. It's such a loaded term now. I would think kind of triangle trade rather than Vikings, and here it's being used for Vikings with horned helmets, which they would never like. The anachronism going on here is incredible. Horned helmets, Roman swords, Gaulish mustaches. I don't really know, but yeah. So it goes the Viking kind of the Scandinavian obsession, kind of those are the whiteness. The idea of whiteness as kind of focusing on this Scandinavian Middle Ages is very deep, and it kind of got it to its deepest depths, as it were, with the Nazis in the 1930s. The Nazis were kind of obsessed, deeply obsessed with kind of what we might call pseudo-Scandinavian myth, right? The kind of Wagnerian, operas of Wagner, the Ring Cycle, that sort of a thing. They also like Odinism, which is a kind of white supremacist religion-ish thing that developed around kind of pagan ideas, or things called esoteric Nazism, which is a great name for something. Sounds like Indiana Jones should be punching it or something like that. Were really important to the Nazis. And this is also because the Nazis had kind of a fraught relationship with Christianity, because they kind of preferred paganism, although not explicitly, because Germany was such a Catholic country, is still such a Catholic country. But Jesus is a Jew, right? And that's kind of a problem if you're a Nazi. And this is also, by the way, kind of as a side note, why Rome is so kind of images of Rome are still popular among the alt-right. Kind of, there's what's his name, Sol Invictus down in Florida or whatever. So this idea of Romanness, of kind of that sort of a thing is very popular kind of in the alt-right, because again, kind of an anti-Christian, this kind of idea of Christianity as a fundamentally kind of Jewish corruption kind of comes from that. That's all kind of a whole side thing. Anyway, the swastika is also a prominent Norse symbol. Like that's where it comes. The Hakenkreuz, right? The hooked cross, is a symbol that occurs all across the world, from Japan to Scandinavia, but the particular kind of direction and things like that. The Nazi version of the swastika comes from kind of a Norse context. And we will come back to this in this particular slide. We'll talk more about this in a little bit. And many of these ideas that were at the center of kind of Anglo-Saxon racism, racialized Anglo-Saxonism, and neo-Nazi movements, Nazi movements, are now kind of at the center of alt-right, neo-Nazi, whatever you want to call them, movements, right? Although kind of changing understandings of race, and kind of a fading of the medieval, of the true medieval history, proper, like authentic medieval history, what kind of I do, I guess, from memory, has allowed these symbols to hide a little bit. And so we have kind of more these more contemporary movements kind of work on dehistoricized, which is to say, neo-medievalist origin myths, which include things like the Crusades. Right. Here we see kind of a spray paint, two things. One, Saracen go home, right? Saracen being a kind of Christian term, a medieval Christian term for Muslims. And also the term Deus Vult, which is Latin for God wills it, which is the Crusader cry. When the Crusaders gathered at Clermont in 1095, they heard a speech by the Pope Urban II, and in response to the speech, they shouted Deus Vult, God wills it, and went off and conquered Jerusalem. Right? So this kind of crusading ideology as part of the alt-right. Also, we see kind of a preponderance of the what's been called the Viking mullet. It's the haircut that what's his name on the Viking show has. The kind of just that. Which is a very kind of common haircut in certain parts of Proud Boy culture and things like that. And we also see things like this. Like we have the shields. These are photos taken at the Unite the Right riot in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. You can see actually, so on the top we have kind of, these are actually Roman things. These are fascisti, the bundles of sticks wrapped around an axe, which is the symbol of imperium or absolute power over life and death in Rome. And you would have men bearing the fascisti accompanying a dictator, a person with absolute authority, or a imperator, which is now our word for emperor, marking that person's ability to summarily execute anyone. And also kind of, you see on the shield on the right, there's the Crusader cross, the equilateral cross with T ends in red, so it's the Templar cross with Deus Vult kind of written across it. And then at the bottom, you have a man carrying a shield with the black eagle that is the symbol of the Holy Roman Empire on it, right? And this is a particularly good example of neo-medieval dehistoricization, right? A sort of a break of kind of a fantasy medieval from historical medievalism, because, of course, the Black Eagle is this guy. And I am absolutely sure that this stupid idiot over here does not actually know that this is whose symbol he's carrying around. There was a Twitter account for a while that was basically devoted to tweeting this image at anyone who had that sort of a shield up. And the responses were quite funny. Also sad, but quite funny. And then you have things like this guy. This guy was the king of I think the Oregon chapter of the SCA, or the Society for Creative Anachronism. This is like a live action role playing kind of a deal. You know, they would do a court, whatever. And if you notice, on his robe, there are quite a few swastikas. This is, again, kind of a neo-medievalism. Because the original item, that this fringe that he's wearing, to be fair to him, this fringe with all the swastikas on it, is copying a Viking item, a Viking era item. It is this. This is a surviving piece of cloth from Viking era, which does indeed have swastikas on it. But if you look closely at it, not only are there swastikas on this guy's thing, there's also this HH motif. Do you see that? Kind of in yellow on both sides. And that motif is not present in this in the original. And that's because this piece is working off another piece that was commissioned from the original by the Nazis, in fact. And the HH is included as a Heil Hitler. So this is kind of a commission on a Nazi reproduction of a Scandinavian piece. And there's some degree of, you can kind of forget, like, which one were they using? Did he really know? I'm not sure. I'm not going to come down on that. But why did the person he commissioned to make this fringe for him kind of come up with this version? Like, where did it was a she, find the pattern to work off of? Well, here. This is the purse lid from the gold. So here, the original item is the gold and the jewels. Everything else is kind of a later reedition, a curatorial reedition. This is called the great purse lid from the find of Cloture, which is gold with red stone inlay. At Sutton Hoo, which is one of the greatest finds of Viking era grave goods, with these kind of what we might call Celtic, although that's a problematic term, kind of decoration. And it has been suspended on this very same reproduction. Do you see the HH right kind of here, right in the middle between the three strings of the purse lid? The very same reproduction, Nazi reproduction of that original fabric in the British Museum. It has been there since the 1930s. And so this shows, in a way, that scholarship, that academic depictions, academic institutions, the British Museum, are both explicitly and implicitly responsible for things like this, right? Either through their actions or their inactions. And we can see this not only in this kind of very obvious, why would we get rid of the thing with swastikas on it when, the alt-right loves both Norse culture and swastikas? I don't know. But also in kind of more subtle things, right? This kind of academic complicity in this culture. Like, for example, as far as I know, this course is unique. Like, just straightforward. Like, I don't think anyone, maybe one or two other professors are teaching a course on this sort of memory of the Middle Ages. There's be a lot of schools where if I said, hey, can I come by and give you a guest lecture on this? The professor would be like, no, go away. Right? So first of all, like, kind of silence. We've already kind of seen also the kind of last lecture, this kind of new medievalist point of view that race is a modern construct, right? And that this idea that the idea that talking about race kind of corrupts one's objectivity, which of course, as we know, creates a white, not a neutral normative past. There's kind of continued use of the terms Germanic and Celtic to describe things that are not language groups. Talk about a Germanic or a Celtic culture, which is totally artificial and has no basis in reality. More particularly recently, DNA particularly has emerged, kind of ancient DNA, paleo DNA, has emerged as pretty much a new racial science. I can't call it anything else. Because origins are not race, right? You can trace a person's genealogy through DNA. You cannot trace a person's race through DNA. I'm sorry. It's impossible. And this, like, kind of, just as, like, we've been talking, Scandinavian item, Scandinavian culture is kind of the most concentrated form where this kind of whiteness occurs, right? There is that assumed ethnocultural uniformity I just talked about that cannot be penetrated by things that are not normatively European, right? In the kind of both scholarly and popular imagination. Racialized, we have the racialized pseudo artifacts like this fringe. And we see actually also things like a systematic erasure of racial markers. Things that, just to make sure no one gets confused, that there weren't black people there. Anything that might be a reference to a black person in a Scandinavian text tends to be kind of effaced. So one of my friends, Nahir Otanyo Garacia, she is a scholar of medieval Icelandic. She has noted that in the kind of Icelandic there's an Icelandic version of the story of Tristan and Isolde, which is a kind of a very popular Germanic myth, which knights and just unrequited love and back and forth and whatever. There's a Icelandic version of that, and when this Icelandic version was translated to English recently, I think she was looking at a translation that was done maybe in 2010. The word blackir, which is black, right? The Icelandic word for black is translated as black when it is applied to animals. when a person is described as black here in this text, it's translated as dark. And similarly, the word svarta, which is also kind of across all Germanic languages means black or dark-skinned, is kind of obscured. Even other things like there's a place in Tristan and Isolde, which is Blackamannavilir, which is the plains of the black man, or the plains of the black man. It's a place. This term in the translation that Nahir was looking at was untranslated. They just left it there because who knows? Similarly, there's a character Isolde Svarta, which is Black Isolde, who is explicitly of Spanish/Moorish descent, and deliberately contrasted with someone called Isolde Bjarta, which is White Isolde. But Isolde Svarta is translated by this translator as Isolde the Dark. Right, again, so black skin, even when we might kind of assume it exists from the original text, is being deliberately kind of removed from the equation because it couldn't possibly exist. Right, again, scholarship, people tend to assume that the medieval past had no race or was therefore white. Any sort of reference to something that disagrees with that must be explained away somehow. And this is why, in short, kind of Heimdall's blackness is so controversial, right? It racializes a space which is not supposed to be raced. It kind of implies that these ethnic groupings are not as white as we think they are. It rejects the idea that skin color kind of affects ownership of history, which is deeply problematic, particularly in places with strong nationalist movements. In Europe, particularly, I'd say France and Hungary are kind of the two examples of this. Remember that the French kind of nationalist terrorist group is the Charles Martel Brigade, right? The guy who supposedly drove the Saracens, drove the Muslims back out of Europe and back into Spain and stopped and saved all of Christianity, except for it never happened, right? We talked about that. And to be fair, Idris Elba, just his very presence just reminds people who don't want to be remembered that black people exist. Right? That's just something that's a thing that exists. That's what he does. Last time I gave this lecture, so 2 years ago, 2018, for Professor Conan's Vikings course. I thought this was a good thing. I kind of ended on a high note that this is Idris Elba has been breaking, because he's in this position, he's started to break down barriers to kind of make people acknowledge that there is a presence for people of color in the Middle Ages. I'm less optimistic about that right now. And that's because I've kind of, not because things have changed, but because I've had kind of time to reflect and think about it more. Specifically, I've been thinking about the fact that kind of following, even though we have an increased presence of persons of color within kind of medieval or pseudo-medieval or neo-medieval frames, where they're allowed to be is limited, right? POCs are only allowed to be in certain roles. Helpers, informants, or captains of the guard. And here's just a collection of images. If you can tell, the Netflix series The Witcher is fucking awful at this. They're also allowed to be villains. Okay, so you have from top left and then going around clockwise, you have Kingdom of Heaven. This guy is a guard for Liam Neeson's character, gets killed off in the first fight scene. Spoilers. You have Morgan Freeman playing a Muslim compatriot to Robin Hood in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Witcher again, black elf boy who kind of just helps the very, very white character along, Idris Elba. white character guarded by, who's a dragon or something, I can't remember, guarded by just two black women, both of whom I think get killed off just halfway through the show because whatever. Hollowed Crown, the bishop, kind of a supporting character, and then again Witcher, captain of the guard. So in this case we have 1, 2, 3, 4 guarding, 2 helpers, kind of accompaniment, and 1 minor character. And this is perfectly typical, right, of the placement of people of color in kind of medieval contexts. Again, places where they're given a fighting role, a physical role, again, playing into tropes of racial tropes, of the idea of blackness as a more physical rather than intellectual activity. Or blackness as a black person as being more physical rather than intellectual. That's kind of a very old racial trope. And this is true even in places where they could fix it, right? Where, as you have surely read in Le Guin's work, where you have characters who are explicitly characters of color. Ged, right? This guy, Sean Ashmore, played when there's 2 versions of kind of the Wizard of Earthsea's kind of universe. One is a 2004 sci-fi miniseries. This guy plays Ged. Copper-skinned, he's described as. There was no controversy about this casting for some reason. Who knows why? And also, this is a Studio Miyazaki depiction of kind of tales from Earthsea. It wasn't very good, but this is again Ged. He has at least slightly darker skin, which is perhaps only to contrast the fact that he does have a scar on his face. But again, is voiced by Timothy Dalton. Like, that's not right. It's just, it's at most kind of barely there. So my question is basically, where do we go from there? I don't have a good answer to it. Because even when we have people who try, like Ursula K. Le Guin, I think does, to have a universe, have a world that breaks from kind of the neo-medievalist insistence on whiteness, whenever that world is converted to a visual culture, that whiteness kind of takes back over again. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts in section this week. Again, if you have questions on this lecture, if you have anything you kind of want to talk about or things that weren't clear and you want me to talk through again, if I mention dates or names of people you don't recognize, send me an email by Thursday at noon, and I will, again, include those in the response video. Office hours are, as usual, on Wednesdays from 1 to 3. People have been dropping by kind of regularly. It's been nice. It's been good to have some conversations. Please come and introduce yourself. Kind of, it's harder to kind of know who people are otherwise this year, just because of the distance. And finally, I look forward to seeing you in section with your responses to Miss Le Guin. And see you then.